On the morning of August 6, 1945, deep inside a converted manor house in the English countryside known as Farm Hall, 10 German physicists sat discussing theoretical physics over breakfast, completely unaware that the world had just changed forever. They believed themselves ahead in the race for atomic weapons, confident that their intelligence networks had accurately reported the impossibility of their enemies achieving what they themselves had deemed impractical. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these brilliant minds were about to discover would shatter not only their scientific confidence, but their entire understanding of how thoroughly they had miscalculated the industrial and intellectual capacity of their opponents, revealing a truth so devastating that some would refuse to believe it, even when confronted with irrefutable evidence. Professor Werner Heisenberg stood by the window of the spacious dining room, his coffee growing cold in his hands as he gazed out at the manicured English gardens. At 43 years old, he remained one of the most celebrated physicists in Europe, a Nobel laureate whose uncertainty principle had revolutionized quantum mechanics. Beside him, Otto Hahn, the chemist who had discovered nuclear fission in 1938, buttered his toast with the methodical precision that characterized all his laboratory work. The 10 men gathered at Farm Hall represented the core of German atomic research during the conflict. They had been captured by Allied forces as Germany collapsed in the spring and transported to this detention facility 30 miles from Cambridge. The British had treated them well, providing comfortable quarters, good food, and access to scientific journals, though always several months old. What the physicists did not know was that every room in the house contained hidden microphones, and British intelligence officers recorded every conversation, every argument, every casual remark. Captain Michael Perrin of the British Intelligence Service sat in a locked room on the 3rd floor, headphones pressed against his ears, listening to the morning chatter of the detained scientists. For 3 months he and his team had monitored these conversations, hoping to learn the true extent of German atomic progress. The physicists spoke freely, believing themselves among friends in a private setting. They discussed their work during the conflict, their frustrations with military leadership, their theories about when they might be released. Perrin had developed a strange familiarity with these voices. He knew that Heisenberg preferred his coffee black and became irritable when denied his afternoon walk. He knew that Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, the youngest of the group at 33, possessed a sharp wit that often lightened the mood. He knew that Otto Hahn suffered from depression and occasionally wept alone in his room, overwhelmed by guilt over how his discovery had been weaponized. The morning of August 6th began like any other. The physicists ate breakfast, read newspapers that were carefully screened before being provided to them, and debated scientific points with the passionate intensity that characterized their profession. Heisenberg argued with Walter Gerlach about the practical difficulties of isotope separation. Hahn discussed crop rotation with one of the guards, who came from a farming family. Kurt Diebner sketched equations on a notepad, trying to solve a problem that had troubled him for weeks. At 6 o'clock that evening, Major Thomas Rittner, the British officer in charge of Farm Hall, entered the drawing room where several physicists had gathered for their customary pre-dinner drinks. He carried a BBC radio, which he placed on the side table and switched on. The physicists looked up with mild interest. They were occasionally allowed to listen to news broadcasts, though always in the presence of guards. The BBC announcer's voice filled the room with crisp, formal pronunciation. He spoke of military operations in the Pacific Theater, of diplomatic maneuvering, of reconstruction efforts in Europe. Then his tone shifted, becoming more dramatic, more weighted with significance. President Truman had authorized the use of a new weapon against Japan. A single device, dropped from a single aircraft, had destroyed the city of Hiroshima. The weapon derived its unprecedented power from atomic fission, releasing energy equivalent to 20,000 tons of conventional explosives. The announcer called it an atomic device, a weapon that changed the fundamental nature of conflict. Heisenberg set down his glass with such force that the crystal rang like a bell. His face had gone pale, his expression frozen in disbelief. Around the room, the other physicists sat motionless, their conversations dying mid-sentence. Hahn stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, his hands trembling. "That is impossible," Heisenberg said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Americans do not have the industrial capacity for isotope separation on that scale. Our intelligence confirmed it. They cannot have more than a few grams of enriched material, certainly not enough for a functional device." Von Weizsäcker moved to the radio, adjusting the dial as if better reception might change what they had heard. The broadcast continued with technical details, sparse but unmistakable. The weapon had utilized uranium-235. The explosion had created a fireball and devastating pressure wave. Casualties were estimated in the tens of thousands. Upstairs in his surveillance room, Captain Perrin leaned forward, his pencil moving rapidly across his notepad. This was the moment British intelligence had been waiting for. How would the German scientists react? Would they claim to have been close to achieving the same result? Would they admit the limitations of their own program? Would they believe the report at all? "It must be propaganda," Diebner declared, his voice rising with agitation. "An exaggeration of a conventional weapon's effects, perhaps a large-scale firebombing that they are misrepresenting for psychological impact." Hahn said nothing. He walked to the window, his shoulders slumped, his reflection ghostly in the darkening glass. Of all the physicists at Farm Hall, he understood most clearly what this announcement meant. His discovery, his life's greatest scientific achievement, had been transformed into a weapon of unimaginable destruction, and it had been accomplished not by his own countrymen, but by the very nations he had been told lacked the scientific sophistication for such an endeavor. The evening meal passed in near silence. The physicists picked at their food, their minds clearly elsewhere. After dinner, they gathered in the sitting room, and the arguments began in earnest. Heisenberg paced back and forth, his hands clasped behind his back in the manner of a lecturer. "The technical challenges are insurmountable," he insisted. "We calculated this precisely. To produce sufficient enriched uranium requires thousands of centrifuges operating continuously for years. The Americans would need to dedicate their entire industrial capacity to such an effort, which would be visible to reconnaissance. Our intelligence networks would have detected such a massive undertaking." "Perhaps your calculations were wrong," Gerlach suggested quietly. "Or perhaps the Americans found a method we did not consider." "Impossible," Heisenberg snapped. "The physics is straightforward. There are only so many approaches to isotope separation, and we explored them all. Either this report is false or they have achieved something that violates our understanding of the practical limitations." Von Weizsäcker sat in an armchair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "I'm troubled by something else," he said. "If the Americans have succeeded, what does that say about our own program? We told ourselves that we chose not to pursue a weapon, because the effort required was too great, the timeline too long. But what if we simply failed where others succeeded?" The room fell silent. This was the question none of them wanted to confront directly. During the conflict, they had worked on atomic research, but their program had never progressed beyond experimental reactors. They had convinced themselves that building an actual weapon was impractical, that the resources required exceeded what any nation could reasonably dedicate during wartime. This belief had allowed them to rationalize their situation, to avoid feeling that they had failed in a crucial task. Hahn finally spoke, his voice hollow and distant. "I did not sleep last night," he said. "I kept thinking about what this means. If it is true, if they have really done this, then thousands of people have perished because of my discovery. Thousands who had no connection to the conflict, who were simply living their lives in that city." "You cannot blame yourself," Diebner said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Scientific discovery is neutral. It is how others choose to use it that determines the moral weight." Hahn shook his head slowly. "That is what we tell ourselves to sleep at night. But I split the atom. I opened this door, and now we see what came through it." Over the following days, as more details emerged through newspaper reports and radio broadcasts, the physicists at Farm Hall struggled to accept the reality of what had occurred. The Americans released additional information about the Manhattan Project, as they called their atomic program. The scale of the effort was staggering, almost incomprehensible. A secret city had been built in Tennessee, housing 75,000 workers who operated massive isotope separation facilities. Another facility in Washington state had produced plutonium using graphite-moderated reactors. A laboratory in New Mexico had assembled and tested the first device. The total cost exceeded $2 billion, an astronomical sum that dwarfed the entire German atomic research budget by orders of magnitude. Heisenberg spent hours with pencil and paper, reviewing his calculations, searching for the error in his reasoning. He had been so certain that the Americans lacked the capability, so confident in the intelligence reports that had reached German leadership. Those reports had painted a picture of scattered research efforts, inadequate funding, insurmountable technical obstacles. Every assumption had been wrong. The hidden microphones captured a conversation between Heisenberg and Hahn on the evening of August 9th, after news reached them of a second atomic device used against Nagasaki. The two men sat alone in the library, speaking in low tones. "We were arrogant," Hahn said simply. "We assumed that because we found certain approaches impractical, they must be impractical for everyone. We underestimated the industrial capacity of our opponents, the willingness to dedicate vast resources to a single objective." Heisenberg nodded slowly, his face drawn with fatigue. "I keep returning to a conversation I had with Albert Speer in 1942. He asked me directly whether an atomic weapon was feasible, whether it could be produced in time to affect the outcome of the conflict. I told him the effort required would be too great, that it could not be done within any reasonable time frame. I was thinking like a scientist, focused on the technical challenges. I failed to imagine the possibility that someone might simply overwhelm those challenges through sheer scale of effort." "Do you think we could have succeeded if we had been given similar resources?" Hahn asked. "If we had been granted billions of Reichsmarks, entire cities dedicated to the project, the full backing of industrial leadership?" Heisenberg considered this for a long moment. "Perhaps," he said finally, "but we were never offered such resources. Our leadership never truly understood what would be required. They wanted quick solutions, miracle weapons that could be developed cheaply and deployed immediately. They could not conceive of a project that would take years and consume vast resources with no guarantee of success. And we did not fight hard enough to make them understand," Hahn said. "We allowed ourselves to believe that it could not be done, because believing otherwise would have forced us to confront our own limitations more directly." The conversations captured by British intelligence revealed a gradual shift in the physicists' understanding. Initially, many had clung to disbelief, insisting the reports must be exaggerated or fabricated. But as evidence accumulated, as technical details emerged that could not be easily dismissed, they were forced to accept an uncomfortable truth. Von Weizsäcker articulated it most clearly in a conversation with Gerlach on August 12th. "We constructed a narrative that made us comfortable," he said. "We told ourselves that the Americans were behind us in atomic research, that their scientists were inferior, that their industrial methods were crude and inefficient. This narrative allowed us to feel superior, even as we sat in detention, even as our nation lay in ruins. Now we must face the reality that we were simply outmatched, that our opponents possessed both the scientific brilliance and the industrial capacity to achieve what we deemed impossible." Gerlach, who had served as the head of German atomic research in the final years of the conflict, sat with his head in his hands. "I should have pushed harder," he said. "I should have demanded more resources, made clearer arguments to military leadership about what would be required. Instead, I accepted the limitations we were given and told myself we were doing the best we could under the circumstances." The British intelligence officers listening to these conversations compiled detailed reports on the German physicists' reactions. What emerged was a portrait of brilliant minds grappling with a profound professional and personal crisis. They had believed themselves at the forefront of atomic research, pioneers in a field they had helped create. Now they confronted evidence that they had been surpassed, that their wartime work had amounted to preliminary experiments, while their opponents had constructed actual weapons of terrible power. Captain Perrin found himself developing an unexpected sympathy for the detained scientists. He listened to Hahn weeping in his room at night, overwhelmed by guilt and despair. He heard Heisenberg's frustration as he worked through calculations again and again, trying to identify where his reasoning had failed. He observed the younger physicists attempting to maintain morale, to find some framework for understanding their situation. that preserved their sense of professional competence. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, citing among other factors the devastating new weapon that had been deployed against his nation. The conflict that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally over. At Farm Hall, the German physicists gathered around the radio to hear the news. "It is finished," Hahn said quietly. "All of it. The conflict, the destruction, the years of suffering. And it ends with the weapon born from my discovery." Von Weizsäcker placed a hand on the older man's shoulder. "You are not responsible for how others chose to use your work. You sought to understand the fundamental nature of matter. What military leaders and politicians did with that knowledge reflects their choices, not yours." But Hahn shook his head. "That distinction provides cold comfort when I think of the people who perished in those 2 cities. They did not choose to be part of any conflict. They were simply there when the sky opened up and fire rained down because of equations I wrote in a laboratory in Berlin. In the weeks that followed, as more information about the Manhattan Project became available, the physicists at Farm Hall began to understand just how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered. The American program had not only succeeded in building atomic devices, but had done so with remarkable efficiency and speed. They had solved problems the German physicists had considered insurmountable. They had built industrial facilities on a scale that defied imagination. Heisenberg obtained a copy of the Smith Report, an official American government document that provided detailed technical information about the Manhattan Project. He read it obsessively, filling notebooks with calculations and observations. What struck him most forcefully was not any single technical innovation, but the sheer audacity of the American approach. They did not allow themselves to be constrained by conventional thinking, he told a group of his colleagues one evening. When they encountered a problem that seemed insurmountable, they simply threw more resources at it until the problem yielded. They built not one experimental facility, but dozens. They pursued multiple approaches simultaneously, accepting enormous costs as the price of success. Diebner nodded slowly. "We kept trying to find the elegant solution, the clever approach that would minimize resource requirements. We thought like academics. They thought like engineers building a bridge or a dam. They wanted a weapon, and they were willing to do whatever proved necessary to obtain it." The realization that began to crystallize among the German physicists was profoundly unsettling. Their failure had not been primarily scientific, but philosophical and cultural. They had approached atomic research with the mindset of scholars seeking theoretical understanding. Their opponents had approached it as an engineering challenge, a problem to be solved through systematic application of industrial capacity and organizational discipline. Moreover, their intelligence about American atomic research had been catastrophically flawed. Reports had consistently underestimated both the scale of the Manhattan Project and the sophistication of American physics. German leadership had been told what they wanted to hear, that their enemies lacked the capability to develop atomic weapons, that German science remained superior. These comforting falsehoods had allowed them to rationalize their own limited progress. Hahn wrote a letter to his wife, which British intelligence intercepted and copied before allowing it to be sent. In it, he struggled to articulate his complicated feelings about what had occurred. "I find myself in a peculiar position," he wrote. "On one hand, I am devastated by the human cost of what has happened. The thought of thousands perishing in an instant because of work that began in my laboratory fills me with profound sorrow. On the other hand, I cannot help but feel a strange admiration for the scientific and industrial achievement represented by the Manhattan Project. They accomplished something extraordinary, something we had convinced ourselves was impossible. This achievement came at a terrible price, but it was an achievement nonetheless." He continued, "I have spent much time reflecting on our own efforts during the conflict. We told ourselves many things to explain why we did not progress further with atomic research. We said the military leadership did not understand the potential. We said resources were too limited. We said the technical challenges were too great. All of this was true to some extent, but we must also acknowledge that we failed to imagine possibilities that others made real. We allowed our sense of what was practical to constrain our thinking. Our opponents did not permit such limitations to stop them." The letter concluded, I do not know what the future holds. We remain detained here in England, uncertain when or if we will be allowed to return home. But I know that when I do return, I will carry with me a profound humility about the limits of my own understanding. I thought I knew what was possible in atomic physics. I thought I understood the boundaries of what could be achieved during wartime. I was wrong on both counts. This is a bitter lesson, but perhaps a necessary one. As summer turned to autumn, the physicists at Farm Hall began to adapt to their new understanding of the situation. They continued their discussions of theoretical physics, but now with a different tone. The easy confidence of earlier months had given way to a more measured assessment of their own work and its implications. Von Weizsäcker organized informal seminars where the group attempted to reconstruct the technical approaches used in the Manhattan Project, based on the limited information available to them. These sessions revealed both the brilliance of American engineering and the gaps in German understanding. Problems they had considered intractable had been solved through innovative applications of existing technology. Challenges they had thought would require years to address had been overcome in months through parallel research efforts and massive resource allocation. Heisenberg found himself reconsidering fundamental assumptions about how scientific research should be conducted. His entire career had been built on the model of small groups of brilliant theorists working with limited experimental support. The Manhattan Project represented something entirely different, a fusion of theoretical physics, industrial engineering, and military organization on an unprecedented scale. In a conversation with Gerlach, he articulated this shift in perspective. "We were wrong about many things," he said, "but perhaps our greatest error was believing that scientific progress must always emerge from individual brilliance, from elegant theories developed by isolated geniuses. The Americans showed that you can achieve remarkable results through systematic organization and massive resource application, even if no single individual makes a breakthrough of historic significance." Gerlach considered this. "So you are saying that teamwork and industrial capacity can substitute for theoretical insight?" "Not substitute," Heisenberg corrected, "complement." The Manhattan Project benefited from brilliant physicists, but it also benefited from thousands of engineers, technicians, and workers who implemented those ideas on an enormous scale. We dismissed this kind of organized effort as crude, as lacking intellectual sophistication. We were mistaken. The hidden microphones captured one final conversation that Captain Perrin found particularly significant. On a cold evening in late November, Hahn and Heisenberg sat alone in the library, discussing what they would do when eventually released and allowed to return to Germany. "We will have to rebuild everything," Heisenberg said, "not just the laboratories and the institutions, but the entire foundation of scientific research in our nation. We will have to do this while living with the knowledge that we failed in the most important scientific challenge of our generation." Hahn looked into the fireplace, watching the flames dance. "Perhaps that failure will prove instructive," he said. "We became arrogant, convinced of our own superiority. We dismissed the capabilities of others because acknowledging those capabilities would have required us to question our assumptions. These were errors born from pride and from a culture that valued certain kinds of thinking over others." He continued, "When we return home, we must build something different, not a scientific establishment that sees itself as superior to others, but one that engages honestly with the international community of researchers. We must train young physicists to value collaboration over competition, to seek truth rather than national glory." Heisenberg nodded slowly. "And we must never again allow ourselves to be so thoroughly deceived by our own intelligence services and our own leadership. We believed what we were told about American atomic research because those reports confirmed what we wanted to believe. We did not question aggressively enough. We did not demand better information. This was a failure of scientific skepticism as much as anything else." The two men sat in silence for several minutes, lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the English countryside had settled into winter darkness. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, casting shifting shadows across the book-lined walls. Finally, Hahn spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "When I return to Germany, I will dedicate whatever years remain to me to ensuring that nuclear physics serves peaceful purposes. I will advocate for international cooperation in atomic research, for transparency rather than secrecy. Perhaps this is naive. Perhaps the forces of military application are too strong to resist. But I must try. I cannot simply accept that my discovery will forever be associated primarily with destruction. Heisenberg reached over and gripped his colleague's shoulder. "We will do this together," he said, "all of us who worked on atomic research during the conflict. We will shoulder the responsibility for what occurred, and we will work to build something better from the ruins." Captain Perrin, listening to this conversation through his headphones, found himself moved despite his professional detachment. These were not evil men, he realized. They were brilliant scientists who had been caught up in events larger than themselves, who had made errors of judgment and suffered devastating consequences. They were now attempting to find meaning in their failure, to extract some lesson that might guide future actions. He included a note in his final report on the farm hall detention. The German physicists represent a cautionary tale about the limits of theoretical brilliance when divorced from practical implementation, about the dangers of cultural arrogance, and about how easily intelligent people can be misled by faulty intelligence and their own preconceptions. Their genuine shock at American atomic success suggests they truly believed their own nation had been leading in this field. This belief was not simply propaganda they repeated for public consumption, but a sincere conviction rooted in incomplete information and flawed analysis. In December of 1945, British authorities informed the detained physicists that they would be released and allowed to return to Germany in the new year. The news was met with mixed emotions. After months of comfortable detention, of intellectual discussions in pleasant surroundings, they would return to a devastated homeland, facing occupation and rebuilding. On their final evening at Farm Hall, the 10 physicists gathered for dinner one last time. They toasted absent colleagues, friends lost during the conflict. They shared memories of their time in detention, both the difficulties and the unexpected pleasures of this period of enforced reflection. Von Weizsäcker raised his glass. "To lessons learned," he said, "to humility in the face of our own limitations, to the hope that we can build something worthwhile from what we now understand." The others echoed the toast, their voices subdued but sincere. Hahn added his own toast. "To the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki," he said quietly, "may their suffering not be in vain. May we who understand the science behind those weapons dedicate ourselves to ensuring such devices are never used again." The room fell silent. Outside, snow had begun to fall, covering the English countryside in white. Inside, 10 physicists contemplated an uncertain future, carrying with them the knowledge that their assumptions about atomic physics, about industrial capacity, about the capabilities of their opponents, had been profoundly and consequentially wrong. The Manhattan Project had not merely succeeded in building atomic weapons, it had demonstrated that the combination of scientific knowledge, industrial might, organizational skill, and unlimited resources could achieve what seemed impossible to those constrained by more limited thinking. The German physicists had approached atomic research with brilliant theoretical insights, but without the cultural and industrial framework necessary to translate those insights into practical weapons. Their intelligence services had failed them catastrophically, providing reassuring but inaccurate assessments of American capabilities. Their military leadership had failed to grasp the scale of effort required for atomic weapons development. But most significantly, they had failed themselves, allowing pride and cultural assumptions to blind them to possibilities they should have considered. When the physicists departed Farm Hall in January of 1946, they carried with them not just personal belongings, but a transformed understanding of science, of war, of their own limitations. They returned to a Germany that lay in ruins, its cities destroyed, its population traumatized, its future uncertain. They would spend the remainder of their lives working to rebuild German physics and to advocate for peaceful uses of atomic energy. Hahn devoted his post-conflict career to nuclear safety and international cooperation. He spoke frequently about the moral responsibility of scientists, about the need for transparency in research that might have military applications. He never entirely overcame his grief over how his discovery had been weaponized, but he channeled that grief into constructive action. Heisenberg rebuilt the German physics establishment, emphasizing international collaboration and theoretical research rather than military applications. He maintained throughout his life that German physicists had not truly attempted to build atomic weapons during the conflict, a claim that historians would debate for decades. But his work at Farm Hall, captured by hidden microphones, revealed a more complicated truth. They had attempted atomic research but had failed to imagine the scale of effort that success would require. The story of the German physicists at Farm Hall represents more than just a tale of scientific competition during conflict. It illustrates how intelligent people can deceive themselves, how cultural assumptions can blind even brilliant minds to possibilities outside their framework of understanding, how pride can lead to catastrophic miscalculation. When news of the Hiroshima device reached those 10 men in an English manor house, it shattered not just their confidence in their own work, but their entire worldview. They had believed themselves at the forefront of atomic physics. They had trusted intelligence reports that confirmed their superiority. They had convinced themselves that what they had failed to achieve could not be achieved by anyone within the time frame of the conflict. The reality proved far different. Their opponents had not only matched their theoretical understanding, but had translated that understanding into functional weapons through unprecedented industrial and organizational effort. The American program had been concealed so effectively that German intelligence never grasped its true scale. The technical challenges German physicists considered insurmountable had been overcome through systematic engineering and massive resource allocation. This revelation forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths. The German scientific establishment had been outthought and outworked. Their intelligence services had provided catastrophically flawed information. Their cultural assumptions about scientific superiority had been exposed as hollow. The conflict had been decided in part by atomic weapons they had convinced themselves could not exist. The transformation that occurred in those physicists during their months at Farm Hall, from confident assertions that American atomic success was impossible to grudging acceptance of a reality that contradicted all their assumptions, represents a microcosm of how Germany as a whole had to confront the gap between its self-perception and its actual capabilities. Pride had led to disaster, arrogance had resulted in defeat. The path forward required humility and honest self-assessment. Years later, when historians gained access to the Farm Hall transcripts, they found in those recorded conversations a remarkable document of human psychology under pressure. Brilliant minds grappling with professional failure. Scientists confronting moral responsibility for their discoveries. Individuals struggling to understand how thoroughly they had been mistaken about facts they had considered settled. The legacy of that August day in 1945, when news of Hiroshima reached 10 detained physicists in rural England, extends far beyond the immediate shock and disbelief. It represents a turning point in understanding how scientific research must be organized, how intelligence must be analyzed, how assumptions must be questioned. The comfortable certainties of those physicists, their conviction that they understood the limits of what was possible, dissolved in the face of evidence that others had achieved what they had deemed impossible. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.